You know those black boxes they always talk about after a plane crash?
Yeah.
Like that recent one in South Korea. Thankfully, everyone survived.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder how they figure out what happened.
Yeah, in those initial hours after an incident, there's so much uncertainty. It's really amazing how those little orange boxes hold so many clues.
Orange boxes, right?
Right.
I always forget they're not actually black.
Yeah, the name is a bit misleading.
I guess I always thought, I've seen documentaries about them, but I never thought about why they'd be called black boxes if they weren't black.
Well, there are a couple theories floating around. Some say the early models were painted black. Others think the name comes from the term black box in electronics. It basically refers to a system where, the inputs and outputs, but not the inner workings.
Okay, I can see that.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what's inside these not-so-black boxes. What exactly do they record?
Well, there are two main components, the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR, and the flight data recorder, or FDR. The CVR captures everything you'd hear in the cockpit. Conversations between the pilots, engine noises, alarms, even radio transmissions.
So it's like a sound recording of those critical moments.
Exactly.
And what about the FDR? What kind of data does it record?
The FDR is all about the plane's performance. It tracks things like altitude, airspeed heading, and even more detailed information like the position of the flaps, the status of the autopilot, and even fuel flow.
Hold on, flap position. Why is that important?
Well, you'd be surprised how crucial that can be. For example, if a plane stalls during landing, knowing the flap position can help investigators understand if the pilots followed proper procedures or if there was a mechanical issue.
Oh, so it's not just the big picture, but also those tiny details that can help investigators reconstruct what happened.
Exactly. And the FDR doesn't just record those details once it constantly monitors and logs them throughout the entire flight. Some models can capture over 1,000 different parameters.
1,000. That's incredible. It really shows how important these boxes are in investigations.
Absolutely. They're like a silent observer, meticulously documenting every aspect of the flight.
Okay, so we've talked about how black boxes help us understand what went wrong after an accident. But can all this data be used for more than just investigations?
That's a great question, and it's one that's being discussed more and more these days. There's a growing movement to use black box data proactively for safety measures, not just reactively after an incident.
So instead of waiting for something to go wrong, we could use this data to prevent accidents from happening in the first place.
Precisely. Imagine if we could use data from routine flights to identify patterns that might point to potential safety risks. For example, consistently hard landings by certain pilots could indicate a need for additional training. Or frequent deviations from standard procedures by an airline might reveal systemic problems that need to be addressed.
It's like using the black box as a tool for continuous improvement, not just a forensic tool after a disaster.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a reactive to a proactive approach to safety.
That's a powerful concept.
Yeah.
But I imagine there are concerns about how this data would be used too.
Of course. Any discussion about expanding the use of black box data has to include the ethical considerations. Pilots might worry about constant surveillance, and airlines won't be hesitant to share data that could expose their vulnerabilities.
It's definitely a balancing act. But are there any examples of how analyzing black box data has already led to safety improvements?
Absolutely. One really interesting example involves landing incidents. By studying data from lots of flights, researchers found that pilots sometimes misjudge their altitude during the final approach, especially in low visibility. This insight led to changes in pilot training, emphasizing the importance of using instruments and not relying solely on visual cues in those situations.
So by looking at patterns in the data, they were able to identify a specific area to improve pilot training.
Exactly. And that's just one example. The possibilities are huge, but using this data responsibly and ethically is crucial.
It makes you wonder what's next for black boxes.
Yeah.
Are there any new technologies that could make them even better?
There are some really exciting developments in the works. One area gaining a lot of attention is real-time data streaming.
Real-time data streaming. So that means transmitting data from the black box to a ground station while the flight is happening.
That's right. Instead of waiting until after an incident, investigators would be able to see key flight parameters in real time.
That would completely change how we respond to accidents, wouldn't it? Imagine being able to see a plane's vital signs as things are happening. It might even help prevent incidents from getting worse.
That's the idea. Of course, transmitting that much data reliably and securely is challenging, but potential benefits are pushing innovation in this area.
It's amazing to think that we might have black boxes that aren't just passive recorders, but actively contribute to keeping flights safe.
It really is a paradigm shift. We're going from reacting to problems to trying to prevent them, and that's incredibly exciting.
But even with all this progress, the fundamental question remains, what should we be recording? If we can track thousands of parameters, where do we draw the line? What data is truly important for safety, and what crosses the line into unnecessary surveillance?
That's the heart of the debate. It's not just about technology, but also about finding the balance between safety and privacy.
And that brings up another question. Who should be able to see this data? Should it be only for investigators after an incident? Or should airlines regulators, even manufacturers, have access to it for training and analysis?
Those are tough questions. There are good arguments on both sides. Transparency and sharing data could lead to big improvements in safety, but we also have to protect against misuse and make sure individual privacy is respected.
It seems like the future of black boxes will be shaped as much by these ethical considerations as by technological advancements.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that needs to happen. As technology develops, we have to talk openly and honestly about how to use this data responsibly and ethically. The stakes are just too high to ignore it.
I think that's a great point to end on. We've explored how black boxes work, how they've changed over time, and what might be next. But as we move forward, it's vital to remember that technology is only one part of the story.
The real challenge is figuring out the ethical complexities and making sure these powerful tools make air travel safer without compromising the values we care about.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into black boxes, we'll leave you with this. How can we use this data to make flying safer while also protecting individual rights and building trust? Something worth thinking about, talking about, and ultimately being informed about. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Absolutely. It really is all about moving from being reactive to proactive when it comes to safety.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. But I also imagine there are concerns about how that data would be used in practice.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime we talk about using black box data in new ways, we have to consider the ethics of it. Pilots might be concerned about constantly being monitored, and airlines might hesitate to share data that could, show their weaknesses.
It's a tricky situation for sure. But are there any real-world examples of how black box analysis has already improved safety?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One really good example has to do with landings. Researchers looked at data from a ton of flights and discovered that pilots sometimes misjudged their altitude right before touchdown, especially in low visibility conditions.
Oh, wow.
And that discovery led to changes in pilot training.
Yeah.
They put more emphasis on double-checking instruments and not relying just on what they could see in those tough situations.
So by looking at those patterns in the data, they found a specific area where pilot training could be improved.
Exactly. And that's just one example. There's so much potential, but we have to make sure we use this data responsibly and ethically.
It really makes you wonder what the future holds for black boxes. I mean, are there any new technologies on the horizon that could make them even more capable?
There are some really cool things being developed. One area that's getting a lot of attention is real-time data streaming.
Real-time data streaming. What is that?
So instead of retrieving the data from the black box after an incident, investigators would be able to access key flight parameters as they're happening, in real time.
So it would be like transmitting the data from the black box to the ground throughout the flight.
That's the idea.
That would revolutionize how we respond to accidents. Imagine being able to track a plane's vital signs as an event unfolds. It could even help prevent situations from escalating.
That's the ultimate goal. But of course, there are technical hurdles to overcome. Transmitting that much data reliably and securely is no small feat. But the potential is driving a lot of innovation.
It's amazing to think that black boxes might someday be more than just passive recorders. They could actively contribute to safety in a really significant way.
It's a real shift in thinking from reacting to problems to proactively preventing them, and that's incredibly exciting.
But even with all these advancements, I think there's a fundamental question we have to answer. What should we be recording? If we had the ability to track thousands of data points, where do we draw the line? What's truly necessary for safety and what crosses over into unnecessary surveillance?
That's the core of the debate. It's not just a technological question, but also about finding that right balance between safety and privacy.
That leads to another big question. Who should have access to all this data? Should it be limited to investigators after an accident? Or should airlines, regulators, even the plane manufacturers have access to use it for things like training and analysis?
Those are tough questions with valid arguments on both sides. On one hand, being transparent and sharing data could lead to major improvements in safety. But we also have to make sure the data isn't misused and that individual privacy is protected.
It sounds like the future of black boxes will be shaped by these ethical questions just as much as by technological advancements.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation we need to keep having. As technology continues to evolve, we have to talk openly and honestly about using this data responsibly and ethically. The stakes are simply too high to ignore these issues.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly this technology has advanced from those first recorders to now where we're talking about, real-time data streaming.
It really has come a long way.
Yeah.
But you're right, the conversation needs to go beyond just the technology itself. We have to consider the human side of things, too, the ethics, the potential consequences.
Speaking of consequences, one thing that stood out to me was the idea of using this data for pilot training. I mean, on the one hand, it could be really valuable for targeted training and improving skills, but wouldn't it also make pilots feel like they're constantly being watched and evaluated?
That's a really valid point. Pilots already go through so much training and scrutiny. Adding another layer of data analysis could feel very invasive, and it might even discourage pilots from reporting incidents for fear of repercussions.
That's a good point. It seems like finding the balance between safety and trust is crucial. But let's say for a moment that we could address those concerns and create a system where this data is used ethically and transparently. What kind of impact could that have on aviation?
The possibilities are really quite incredible. I mean, imagine a future where we could use this data not just to improve pilot training, but also to design safer planes, develop better air traffic control procedures, and even predict potential maintenance issues before they happen.
It sounds like we're moving toward a future where flying isn't just statistically safe, but truly understood and managed in a way that minimizes risk at every level.
Exactly. And the black box in all its evolving forms would be right at the center of that transformation.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've gone deep into how black boxes work, explored the potential of real-time data, and wrestled with those ethical questions about how we use this powerful data. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And I hope our deep dive today has sparked some curiosity and encouraged our listeners to continue exploring these complex and really important issues.
And as always, the quest for knowledge doesn't end here. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the world around you. Until next time.